The champagne flute slipped from my fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of what had once been my kitchen. Through the French doors leading to the garden terrace, I could see my son Daniel laughing with his wife Vivian as they signed papers with the real estate agent, finalizing the sale of my home while I stood invisible in the shadows of my own dining room. The sound of their celebration felt like nails on a chalkboard, but it was Vivian's words from earlier that morning that kept echoing in my mind like a death knell. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Thank God we finally found a way to deal with our charity case, she had whispered to Daniel, not knowing I was standing just around the corner. Your mother has been bleeding us dry for months. At least now we can get some return on all the money we've been throwing at her out of pity. Charity case. After 63 years of building a life, raising a family, and creating something meaningful in this world, I had been reduced to nothing more than a burden that needed to be managed. The woman who had once hosted charity galas in this very house, who had donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to causes she believed in, was now someone else's charity project. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so devastating. My name is Alma Grace Lewis, and until 18 months ago I thought I understood exactly who I was and where I belonged in this world. I was the widow of Thomas Lewis, successful entrepreneur and philanthropist. I was the mother of Daniel Lewis, accomplished attorney and devoted son. I was the grandmother of twin girls who called me Nana Grace and ran to my arms every Sunday after church. I was the former president of the Riverside Women's Foundation, the organizer of the annual spring charity auction, and the woman who had helped build the new pediatric wing at Mercy General Hospital. I thought I was loved, respected, and valued by the people who mattered most. I thought my family saw me as the strong, capable woman I had always been. I thought the foundation of trust and mutual respect that Thomas and I had built over 42 years of marriage would extend to our son and his family, creating a legacy of love that would last generations. I was catastrophically wrong about everything. Standing there in the wreckage of what had been my sanctuary, watching strangers walk through my home and calculate its worth in dollars and square footage, I realized that the past year and a half had been nothing but an elaborate performance. Every concerned phone call, every offer of help, every gentle suggestion about what might be best for me had been carefully orchestrated to bring me to this exact moment. Broken, isolated, and completely dependent on the very people who had been systematically destroying my independence. But what they didn't know, what Vivian couldn't have anticipated when she made that comment about their charity case, was that I had been taking notes. Mental notes, financial notes, and most importantly, legal notes about every conversation, every decision, and every dollar that had changed hands since Thomas died. The woman they thought was too grief-stricken and confused to understand what was happening around her had actually been documenting their every move. The sweet, accommodating mother and grandmother they had been managing and manipulating was about to remind them exactly who Alma Grace Lewis really was. And it was going to cost them everything they thought they had gained by underestimating me. The story begins not with betrayal, but with love. Real, profound, life-altering love that shaped everything I believed about family, loyalty, and the bonds that tie people together across decades of shared experiences. To understand how completely I was deceived, you need to understand what I thought I was building and protecting all those years. Thomas Lewis swept into my life during my senior year at Northwestern University like a force of nature wrapped in a perfectly tailored suit. I was studying social work with dreams of changing the world one family at a time, and he was finishing his MBA with plans to build an empire that would create jobs and opportunities for entire communities. We met at a campus mixer that I almost didn't attend, and from the moment he introduced himself with that crooked smile and those impossibly blue eyes, I knew my carefully planned future had just taken an unexpected turn. "Alma Grace," he said, testing my name like he was tasting fine wine. "That's a name that sounds like it belongs in a fairy tale. Are you sure you're real, or did I wander into some kind of dream?" It was a terrible pickup line, cheesy and overdramatic, but there was something in his voice that made it sound sincere rather than practiced. Thomas had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, like your thoughts and opinions mattered more than anything else he could be doing at that moment. It was a gift that would serve him well in business and make him the kind of husband who remembered every anniversary, every birthday, and every small detail that made you feel cherished. Our courtship was like something out of a romantic movie. Weekend drives along Lake Michigan, picnics in hidden gardens, long conversations about our dreams and fears that stretched late into the night. Thomas would show up at my dorm with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery, having driven 20 minutes out of his way just to see me smile. He'd leave little notes tucked into my textbooks, silly drawings that made me laugh during particularly boring lectures, and flowers delivered to my work-study job at the campus library. But it wasn't just the grand gestures that won my heart. It was the way he listened when I talked about my passion for helping families in crisis, how he encouraged my dreams, even when they seemed impossibly ambitious for a girl from a small town in Ohio. Thomas never made me feel like my goals were less important than his, never suggested that marriage meant I should abandon my own aspirations. Instead, he found ways to weave our dreams together, creating a vision of a future where we could build something meaningful as partners in every sense of the word. "When I make my first million," he told me one evening as we walked hand in hand through the campus quad, "we're going to use it to fund your family crisis center. We'll call it the Alma Grace Foundation, and it's going to help more families than you ever imagined possible." The proposal came on graduation day, right there on the steps of the library where we'd spent countless hours studying together. Thomas got down on one knee in front of my parents, his parents, and half the graduating class, presenting me with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother and a speech about how he wanted to spend the rest of his life making my dreams come true. When I said yes, the crowd erupted in cheers, and I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Thomas kept his promise about the $1 million, though it took him 3 years instead of 1. Lewis Enterprises started as a small construction company focusing on affordable housing developments. But Thomas had a vision that extended far beyond building houses. He wanted to create communities, complete neighborhoods with schools, parks, shopping centers, and everything families needed to thrive. His passion for creating opportunities for working families aligned perfectly with my desire to support those same families when they faced challenges. By our 5th wedding anniversary, we had established the Alma Grace Foundation, just as he had promised. The foundation focused on family crisis intervention, providing emergency financial assistance, counseling services, and temporary housing for families facing unemployment, domestic violence, or other life-altering challenges. Thomas handled the business side, using his growing network of contractors, suppliers, and investors to fund our operations, while I managed the direct services, working with families to help them stabilize and rebuild their lives. Those early years were magical in their intensity and purpose. We worked 18-hour days, driven by a shared mission that felt bigger than ourselves. Thomas would come home from construction sites covered in dust and immediately sit down to review grant applications with me over dinner. I'd spend my days counseling families in crisis, and my evenings helping Thomas plan the next neighborhood development, both of us convinced that we were building something that would outlast us and benefit generations of families. Daniel arrived when I was 28, a perfect baby with Thomas's blue eyes and my stubborn chin. Watching Thomas become a father was like falling in love with him all over again. He would spend hours reading bedtime stories in different voices, building elaborate block castles, and patiently teaching Daniel to throw a baseball in our backyard. Sunday mornings became sacred family time, with Thomas making his famous blueberry pancakes while Daniel and I set the table and planned our week together. "This little guy is going to grow up knowing what it means to help other people," Thomas would say, bouncing Daniel on his knee while we reviewed foundation paperwork. "He's going to understand that success isn't just about what you achieve for yourself, but about what you can do for your community."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
As Daniel grew older, he became an integral part of our foundation work. He'd come with us to community events, help distribute food baskets during the holidays, and even give little speeches at fundraising dinners about the importance of helping families in need. By the time he was in high school, Daniel was volunteering at our crisis center every weekend, tutoring children whose families were staying in our temporary housing program. "I want to be a lawyer," he announced during his junior year, "so I can help families legally, the way you and Mom helped them emotionally and financially. We could have a whole Lewis family approach to crisis intervention." Thomas and I were so proud we could barely contain ourselves. Our son had grown into exactly the kind of young man we had hoped to raise. Someone who understood that privilege came with responsibility, and that success meant lifting others up alongside yourself. When Daniel graduated valedictorian and received a full scholarship to Yale Law School, it felt like validation of everything we had tried to teach him about values, hard work, and service to others. The foundation continued to grow throughout Daniel's college and law school years. We expanded our services to include job training programs, financial literacy classes, and a microfinance initiative that helped families start small businesses. Lewis Enterprises had become one of the most respected development companies in the Midwest, known for creating communities that actually served the people who lived in them, rather than just maximizing profits for investors. By our 20th wedding anniversary, Thomas and I were fixtures in Chicago's philanthropic community. We hosted annual charity galas that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for various causes, served on the boards of multiple nonprofit organizations, and had been recognized by the mayor for our contributions to affordable housing and family services. Our marriage had become a true partnership in every sense, built on shared values, mutual respect, and a love that had only deepened over the years. "Look what we built together," Thomas said during his speech at our anniversary party, gesturing to the crowd of friends, family, and colleagues who had gathered to celebrate with us. "None of this would have meant anything without Alma Grace by my side. She's the heart of everything good in my life, and I'm grateful every day that she said yes to building this life with me." Daniel met Vivian during his final year at Northwestern Law, and initially I thought she was exactly what he needed. She was beautiful, certainly, with the kind of effortless elegance that suggested she'd grown up with advantages Daniel and I could appreciate. But more importantly, she seemed to share his passion for justice and helping others. Vivian was completing her master's degree in nonprofit management, with plans to work for international humanitarian organizations. She spoke eloquently about global poverty, environmental justice, and the responsibility of privileged people to use their resources for positive change. "I've been looking for someone who understands that success means more than just personal achievement," Daniel told us during his first visit home after meeting Vivian. "She's brilliant, Mom. She speaks 4 languages. She's spent summers volunteering in Guatemala and Kenya, and she has these incredible ideas about how to scale charitable work to reach more people." When Daniel brought Vivian home for Christmas that year, I was prepared to love her, simply because Daniel did. But I found myself genuinely impressed by her intelligence, her apparent compassion, and her obvious adoration of my son. She asked thoughtful questions about our foundation work, offered insightful suggestions about program improvements, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding how Thomas and I had built our life together. "Mrs. Lewis," she said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner while the men watched football in the living room, "I hope you know how inspirational your work has been for me. Daniel talks about you all the time, how you've managed to balance marriage, motherhood, and meaningful career achievements. I want to build something like that with him, a partnership where we're both working towards something bigger than ourselves." Her words felt sincere, her admiration seemed genuine, and her love for Daniel was obvious in every glance and gesture. When they announced their engagement 6 months later, Thomas and I were delighted. We had raised a son who had chosen a woman who shared our values, understood our priorities, and would hopefully help carry on the legacy of service and philanthropy that had defined our family for generations. The wedding was everything a mother could hope for her son. Vivian looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace gown, Daniel couldn't stop smiling, and their vows were so heartfelt that half the congregation was in tears. During the reception, Vivian made a point of telling everyone how grateful she was to be joining a family that had taught her so much about the importance of giving back to the community. "I'm not just gaining a husband," she said during her speech, looking directly at Thomas and me with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "I'm gaining parents who have shown me what it means to build a life of purpose and meaning. I promise to honor the Lewis family tradition of service, and I hope that someday Daniel and I can make a contribution to this community that's worthy of the example you've set." The first few years of their marriage seemed to fulfill every hope I'd had for my son's future. Daniel joined a prestigious law firm that specialized in public interest litigation, while Vivian took a position with an international relief organization that allowed her to travel to developing countries implementing clean water programs. They bought a beautiful home just 20 minutes away from Thomas and me, and we quickly settled into a comfortable routine of family dinners, holiday celebrations, and shared involvement in various charitable projects. When Vivian announced she was pregnant with twins, I thought my heart might burst with joy. Thomas and I had been hoping for grandchildren for years, and the prospect of 2 babies at once felt like the universe's way of blessing our family with abundance. I immediately began planning the nursery, researching the best pediatricians, and dreaming about all the ways I could spoil these precious additions to our family. "I want them to grow up knowing their Nana Grace," Vivian said, her hand resting on her growing belly as we sat in what would become the twins' nursery. "I want them to understand what it means to help other people the way you taught Daniel. These babies are going to be so lucky to have you as their grandmother." Emma Rose and Lily Catherine were born on a perfect spring morning, 2 beautiful girls with Daniel's blue eyes and Vivian's delicate features. Holding them for the first time, I felt a completeness I hadn't known I was missing. These weren't just my granddaughters. They were the future of everything Thomas and I had built, the next generation who would carry forward our family's commitment to making the world a better place. For the first 2 years of the twins' lives, everything seemed perfect. I spent every Wednesday babysitting while Daniel and Vivian worked, and they brought the girls to our house every Sunday for family dinner. The twins called me Nana Grace and would run to my arms the moment they saw me, chattering about their week and showing me their latest drawings and achievements. Thomas, who had slowed down his business activities to spend more time with family, became the most devoted grandfather imaginable, building elaborate playhouses and teaching the girls to garden in our backyard. "Look at what we created," Thomas said one Sunday evening as we watched Daniel push the twins on the swings we'd installed in our oak tree. 4 generations of Lewis women who are going to change the world, starting with our granddaughters. I thought he was right. I thought we had built something unshakable, a family legacy based on love, shared values, and mutual respect that would last for generations. I thought the foundation Thomas and I had created, both literally and figuratively, would continue to grow and evolve with each new addition to our family. I had no idea that everything I believed about my family, my marriage, and my place in the world was about to be systematically destroyed by the very people I loved most. I had no idea that Vivian's admiration was performance, Daniel's respect was conditional, and the foundation we'd built was far more fragile than I'd ever imagined. The cracks began to appear so gradually that I didn't recognize them as warning signs until it was almost too late. But on that sunny Sunday when Thomas pointed to our son and granddaughters playing in our backyard, talking about the legacy we'd created together, I still believed that love and family were the most important things in the world. I still believed that the people who mattered most would always have my back, just as I would always have theirs. I was about to learn that family loyalty, like everything else in life, sometimes comes with conditions that no one tells you about, until it's too late to meet them. Thomas collapsed on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, while reviewing blueprints for our latest affordable housing project in his home office. One moment he was sketching modifications to make the units more accessible for elderly residents, and the next moment he was gone, claimed by the massive stroke that the doctors said he never could have survived, no matter how quickly we'd gotten him to the hospital. I found him there 3 hours later when I came home from a foundation board meeting, slumped over his drafting table with his reading glasses still perched on his nose and his coffee still warm beside his elbow. For a moment, I thought he was just taking a nap, the way he sometimes did when he worked too hard and forgot to pace himself. But when I called his name and he didn't stir, when I touched his shoulder and felt the unnatural stillness, I knew that the life we'd built together had ended as suddenly and unexpectedly as it had begun. The funeral was everything Thomas would have wanted, a celebration of a life well lived, surrounded by the hundreds of people whose lives he had touched through 4 decades of business and philanthropy. The church was packed beyond capacity, with standing room only for the contractors, suppliers, city officials, and foundation clients who had come to pay their respects. Daniel delivered a eulogy that was both heartbreaking and inspiring, talking about his father's legacy of service and the example he'd set for future generations of the Lewis family. "My father believed that success was measured not by what you accumulated for yourself, but by what you contributed to your community," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "He taught me that privilege comes with responsibility, and that the greatest honor in life is to use your advantages to lift up those who haven't been as fortunate. Vivian sat beside me in the front pew, holding my hand and whispering words of comfort throughout the service. She seemed genuinely devastated by Thomas's death, crying openly during the hymns and squeezing my fingers when the emotions became too overwhelming. After the burial, she stayed close to my side during the reception, making sure I ate something and gracefully handling the stream of condolence visitors who wanted to share their memories of Thomas. "He was so proud of you, Mrs. Lewis," she said as we finally sat down together in a quiet corner of the parish hall. "He used to tell Daniel and me that marrying you was the smartest decision he'd ever made, that everything good in his life started with convincing you to take a chance on him." Her words were exactly what I needed to hear in that moment, a reminder that Thomas and I had built something beautiful together, something that would continue to matter even though he was gone. I felt grateful to have Vivian as a daughter-in-law, someone who understood the depth of my loss and seemed committed to helping me navigate the difficult months ahead. The first few weeks after the funeral passed in a blur of paperwork, condolence calls, and the overwhelming task of managing Thomas's business affairs. Lewis Enterprises had been structured so that I inherited Thomas's controlling interest, making me the majority owner of a company with dozens of ongoing projects and hundreds of employees. The Alma Grace Foundation continued to operate smoothly, since I had always been its primary manager, but the construction business represented a world I had supported rather than directly managed. Daniel stepped up immediately, taking leave from his law firm to help me understand the company's financial situation and make decisions about its future. We spent hours in Thomas's office, going through contracts, reviewing project timelines, and meeting with the senior managers who had worked closely with Thomas for years. Everyone assured me that the company was in excellent financial health, with a strong management team capable of handling day-to-day operations while I learned the ropes. "Dad built this company to last," Daniel told me one evening as we finished reviewing the quarterly reports. "The managers know what they're doing, the projects are all profitable, and the reputation Dad built will carry the company forward. You don't need to worry about making any major changes right away. Just focus on healing, and let the team do what they do best." Vivian was equally supportive during those early weeks, bringing me meals, helping me organize Thomas's personal belongings, and offering to handle the correspondence from the dozens of organizations where Thomas had served on boards or committees. She seemed to understand that I was overwhelmed by the scope of decisions that needed to be made, and she volunteered to research various options to help me make informed choices. "You don't have to figure everything out at once," she said, sitting with me in Thomas's office as I stared at stacks of documents that needed my signature. "Why don't you let me go through these board positions and figure out which ones might be most important for you to continue? Some of them might be too time-consuming, especially while you're grieving and learning to manage the business." Her offer seemed thoughtful and practical. Thomas had served on 14 different boards, from the Hospital Foundation to the Chamber of Commerce to various arts organizations. Trying to maintain all of those commitments while learning to run Lewis Enterprises would have been impossible, and Vivian's nonprofit management background made her qualified to assess which positions would be most valuable. The first decision that seemed questionable came about 6 weeks after the funeral, when Vivian suggested that I might want to step back from my role as president of the Riverside Women's Foundation. I had founded the organization 12 years earlier and had been its primary leader since its inception, but Vivian argued that the stress of managing both the foundation and Lewis Enterprises might be too much for someone dealing with recent grief. "I've been talking to some of the other board members," she said during one of our weekly planning sessions, "and they're concerned about your ability to give the organization the attention it deserves while you're managing so many other responsibilities. Maybe this would be a good time to transition to an advisory role and let someone else take over the day-to-day leadership." The suggestion caught me off guard. The Riverside Women's Foundation had been my passion project, the organization where I'd poured my heart and expertise for over a decade. We'd built it from nothing into a major force for women's economic empowerment in the Chicago area, providing microloans, business training, and mentorship for women starting their own enterprises. The idea of stepping away from leadership felt like abandoning something that was fundamentally part of who I was. But Vivian's reasoning made sense on the surface. I was overwhelmed, I was grieving, and I did have new responsibilities with Lewis Enterprises that demanded significant time and attention. When she mentioned that several board members had expressed concerns, I felt a stab of doubt about my own judgment. Maybe I wasn't as capable of managing multiple commitments as I'd always believed. "I suppose you're right," I said reluctantly. "If the board thinks it would be better for the organization, maybe I should consider stepping back to an advisory position." Who did they have in mind to take over as president? Vivian's smile was warm and reassuring. "Actually, they asked if I might be interested in the position. I know it's a big responsibility, but I have the nonprofit management background, and I've been learning so much about the organization by working with you these past few weeks. I think I could provide the kind of fresh energy and perspective that might help the foundation grow to the next level." The suggestion that Vivian take over my position felt like being punched in the stomach, but her reasoning was logically sound. She did have the right credentials, she had been involved with the foundation's work through her marriage to Daniel, and she was younger and presumably more energetic than a 63-year-old widow who was still processing her grief. If the board members really thought a change in leadership would benefit the organization, maybe my personal feelings shouldn't be the primary consideration. I agreed to the transition, though it felt like giving away another piece of my identity during a time when I was already struggling to understand who I was without Thomas. The board meeting where Vivian officially took over was polite and professional, with everyone expressing gratitude for my years of service and enthusiasm for the fresh direction Vivian would bring to the organization. I tried to smile and act gracious, but inside I felt hollow, like I was watching someone else take possession of something that had been fundamentally mine. The changes at Lewis Enterprises began more subtly, with Daniel suggesting that I might benefit from hiring a business manager to help handle the day-to-day operations while I was still learning the industry. His recommendation was a man named Harrison Blackwood, who had worked with several family-owned construction companies and specialized in helping transitions after the death of a founder. "Harrison comes highly recommended," Daniel told me as we sat in what had been Thomas's office, reviewing the consultant's credentials. "He understands the unique challenges of keeping a family business running when the person who built it is no longer available to make decisions. He can handle the routine management tasks while you focus on the bigger picture strategic decisions." Harrison Blackwood was everything you'd expect from a high-end business consultant. Expensive suits, impressive credentials, and a way of speaking that made even simple concepts sound sophisticated and complex. During our initial meeting, he reviewed Lewis Enterprises' financial statements, with the kind of thorough analysis that made me feel like I'd been managing the company carelessly during my first few months as owner. "Mrs. Lewis," he said, spreading charts and graphs across the conference table, "your husband built an impressive organization, but there are several areas where more professional management could significantly improve profitability and efficiency. The construction industry has changed dramatically in recent years, and some of the approaches that worked well in the past may not be optimal going forward." His recommendations seemed reasonable enough. Streamline the management structure, implement more sophisticated accounting systems, negotiate better terms with suppliers, and focus on higher margin projects that would generate more profit per dollar invested. When he suggested that I might want to take a step back from daily operations and let him implement these improvements over the next 6 months, it felt like the logical thing to do. "You'll remain the owner and the final decision maker on all major issues," Harrison assured me. "But for the day-to-day management tasks, it would be more efficient if you delegated authority to someone with extensive experience in the construction industry. You can focus on the aspects of the business that interest you most, while I handle the operational details that require technical expertise." Within 2 months of hiring Harrison, I began to feel like a stranger in the company Thomas and I had built together. Meetings that I had always attended were now handled by Harrison and his team. Decisions that Thomas would have discussed with me were made without my input. Projects that had reflected our shared values of affordable housing and community development were replaced by higher-margin developments that served wealthier clients and generated better returns for investors. When I questioned some of these changes, Harrison had reasonable explanations for each decision. The affordable housing projects were too labor-intensive and generated insufficient profit to justify the time investment. The community development initiatives required too much coordination with municipal authorities and nonprofit partners. The company needed to focus on core competencies and maximize efficiency if it wanted to remain competitive in a challenging market. "Your husband was a visionary," Harrison told me during one of our monthly review meetings, "but his approach was sometimes more idealistic than practical. He could afford to prioritize community benefit over profitability because he was personally involved in managing every aspect of the business. Now that the company needs to operate without his direct oversight, it makes sense to focus on strategies that are more systematically profitable. Each explanation made sense individually, but collectively they felt like Thomas's legacy was being dismantled piece by piece. The company that had been built on principles of community service and affordable housing was becoming just another construction business focused on maximizing returns for its owner. The employees who had worked with Thomas for years began treating me with the polite deference reserved for absentee owners, rather than the collaborative respect I'd enjoyed when Thomas was alive. The transformation of my role from active partner to passive beneficiary became complete when Harrison suggested that I might want to consider moving to a smaller, more manageable home. The house Thomas and I had shared for over 20 years was expensive to maintain, he pointed out, and much larger than what a single person really needed. The equity tied up in real estate could be invested more profitably, and a smaller home would reduce my monthly expenses while providing a more appropriate living situation for a widow. Many of my clients find that downsizing after the death of a spouse is emotionally healthy as well as financially practical, Harrison said, presenting me with real estate listings for luxury condominiums that were half the size of my current home. Living in a space so closely associated with your husband might be preventing you from moving forward with your life. A fresh start in new surroundings could be exactly what you need. The suggestion felt like the final assault on everything that had defined my life with Thomas. Our home wasn't just real estate. It was the place where we'd raised Daniel, hosted foundation board meetings, and entertained the friends and colleagues who had become our extended family. The garden where Thomas had taught our granddaughters to plant seeds, the kitchen where we'd cooked hundreds of meals for visiting guests, the office where we'd planned both business ventures and charitable initiatives. Selling the house would be like erasing the physical evidence that our life together had ever existed. But Harrison's financial arguments were compelling. The house was expensive to maintain, especially for someone living alone. The property taxes and utilities represented a significant monthly expense that could be eliminated by moving to a smaller space. The equity could be invested to generate additional income that would provide long-term financial security. When Daniel and Vivian both agreed that downsizing might be a wise financial decision, I felt outnumbered by people who seemed to understand my situation better than I understood it myself. The process of selling the house felt like dismantling my own life piece by piece. Harrison hired an estate sale company to dispose of furniture and belongings that wouldn't fit in my new condominium. The dining room set where we'd hosted countless family dinners was sold to strangers. The antique secretary desk where I'd written foundation grant proposals was hauled away by people who had no idea of its significance. Thomas's workshop in the basement, where he'd built playhouses and dollhouses for his granddaughters, was cleared out and emptied, as if it had never contained anything meaningful. Vivian volunteered to help me choose which items to keep and which to sell, but her criteria seemed focused on practicality rather than sentimental value. She suggested that I keep only the most valuable pieces, items that would fit comfortably in my new space and maintain their worth as investments. The photograph albums, Thomas's personal books, and the small mementos that represented decades of shared memories were dismissed as clutter that would just make moving more complicated. "You want to start fresh," she said, wrapping my grandmother's china in newspaper with efficient movements that suggested she'd done this before. "Holding on to too many reminders of the past might make it harder for you to adjust to your new life. You'll be happier with just the essentials and a few special pieces that really matter." The condominium Harrison helped me select was everything he'd promised. Modern, efficient, and requiring minimal maintenance. The building offered services like housekeeping, lawn care, and even meal planning for residents who wanted to simplify their lives. My new neighbors were other widows and retirees who had made similar transitions, people who understood the challenges of starting over after decades of married life. But the space felt nothing like home. The walls were beige and bland, without the character marks and personal touches that had accumulated over decades in our family house. The kitchen was so small that I could barely prepare meals for more than 2 people, making it impossible to host the family dinners that had been such an important part of our traditions. The guest bedroom was tiny, with barely enough space for a single bed, making it clear that overnight visitors would need to find alternative accommodations. Most painfully, there was no space for the twins to play when they visited. No backyard for running and exploring. No workshop where their grandfather's tools still waited for small hands to learn carpentry. No garden where they could plant seeds and watch them grow. The girls seemed confused and subdued during their first visit to my new home, staying close to their parents instead of running free the way they had at the house where they'd spent every Sunday since birth. "It's different, Nana Grace," Emma said, sitting politely on my new sofa instead of sprawling on the floor the way she used to. "Where are all your things?" "Where's the swing Grandpa made for us?" I tried to explain that sometimes people needed to move to smaller places, that Nana Grace's new home was easier to take care of and more suitable for someone living alone. But even as I spoke the words, they felt hollow and inadequate. The truth was that I had no good explanation for why everything familiar and comforting had been stripped away, replaced by efficiency and practicality that served no one except the people who had convinced me that this was what I needed. The monthly allowance system began about 6 months after I moved to the condominium, presented as a way to simplify my financial management during a time when I was still adjusting to widowhood. Harrison explained that managing the income from Lewis Enterprises, the foundation endowment, and my personal investments required expertise that most people didn't possess, especially people dealing with the emotional stress of recent loss. Many of my clients find it easier to receive a monthly distribution that covers all their living expenses rather than trying to manage multiple income streams and investment accounts, he said, presenting me with projected budgets that showed how much I would need for housing, food, transportation, and personal expenses. This approach ensures that your long-term financial security is protected while giving you the freedom to focus on enjoying your retirement rather than worrying about market fluctuations and investment strategies. The proposed monthly allowance was generous enough to cover my condominium expenses, utilities, food, and reasonable personal spending without requiring me to think about budgets or financial planning. Harrison would manage all the investment decisions, handle tax preparation, and provide quarterly reports showing how my assets were growing under professional management. I would simply receive a monthly check and live comfortably without the stress of financial decision-making. What I didn't realize at the time was that accepting the allowance system meant giving up access to the detailed information about my own financial situation. I no longer received statements from Lewis Enterprises showing company profits and losses. I no longer had direct access to the foundation's investment accounts or grant-making decisions. I no longer knew how much money I actually had or how it was being managed on my behalf. Daniel and Vivian both endorsed the arrangement enthusiastically, pointing out that it would give me more time to focus on adjusting to my new life and perhaps developing new interests and hobbies. They suggested that managing money had always been Thomas's responsibility anyway, and that trying to learn complex financial management during a period of grief would be unnecessarily stressful. "You deserve to enjoy your golden years without worrying about investment portfolios and tax strategies," Vivian said, reviewing the monthly budget projections with me over coffee in my new kitchen. "Harrison is highly qualified to handle those details, and this way you can focus on taking care of yourself and maybe traveling or pursuing interests you never had time for when you were managing the foundation." The suggestion that I develop new interests felt strange, since I had spent decades pursuing meaningful work that I was passionate about. But everyone seemed to assume that retirement should involve leisure activities, rather than continued involvement in causes that mattered to me. When I mentioned that I might want to volunteer with other charitable organizations, both Daniel and Vivian discouraged the idea, suggesting that I had already given enough of my life to helping others and deserved to focus on my own happiness. The isolation became more pronounced as months passed, and I found myself with less and less connection to the work and relationships that had defined my adult life. The Riverside Women's Foundation continued operating under Vivian's leadership, but I was no longer invited to board meetings or consulted about major decisions. Lewis Enterprises functioned smoothly under Harrison's management, but I felt like an absentee owner rather than someone with meaningful input about the company's direction. My social circle, which had been built largely around shared work in philanthropy and community development, gradually faded as I no longer attended the meetings, events, and fundraisers where I had maintained those relationships. The friends who had been part of my life through foundation work seemed to assume that I was enjoying retirement and didn't want to be bothered with the obligations and commitments that had once energized me. Daniel and Vivian continued to visit regularly, bringing the twins for Sunday dinners that were smaller and more subdued than the family gatherings we'd enjoyed in my previous home. But our conversations increasingly focused on my health, my adjustment to retirement, and my need to take better care of myself rather than discussions about meaningful work or shared projects. I felt like I was being treated as someone to be managed and protected, rather than someone with valuable experience and ongoing contributions to make. The most painful realization was how quickly I had been erased from the organizations and causes that had been central to my identity for decades. The woman who had built the Alma Grace Foundation from nothing was now receiving updates about its activities secondhand through Daniel and Vivian. The co-founder of Lewis Enterprises was now a passive recipient of monthly reports about a company she no longer recognized. The former president of the Riverside Women's Foundation was now just another donor, whose contributions were acknowledged with polite thank you notes. In less than 18 months, I had gone from being Alma Grace Lewis, community leader and philanthropist, to being simply Daniel's mother and the twins' grandmother. My value seemed to be measured entirely by my relationships to other people, rather than my own accomplishments, expertise, or ongoing potential for meaningful contribution. I had become exactly what everyone seemed to think I should be. A well-cared-for widow whose primary job was to accept the decisions other people made on her behalf. But what neither Harrison nor Daniel nor Vivian understood was that being marginalized and managed had given me something they hadn't anticipated: time to observe, time to think, and time to notice things that busy, important people often overlooked. While they were making decisions about my life and my assets, I was paying attention to details that would eventually reveal the true nature of their concern for my welfare. The woman they thought was too grief-stricken and confused to manage her own affairs was actually taking careful notes about every conversation, every decision, and every dollar that changed hands. And those notes were about to become very important indeed. The awakening began with a coffee stain on a financial document that Harrison had left carelessly on my kitchen counter during one of his monthly visits. He had been rushing to another appointment and gathered his papers hastily, not noticing that one sheet had slipped from his folder and landed face down beside my coffee maker. When I picked it up to return it to him, the coffee had soaked through enough to make the numbers on the back side visible through the paper. What I saw made my hand shake as I held the document up to the light. It was a profit distribution statement from Lewis Enterprises, showing quarterly earnings that were nearly 3 times higher than what Harrison had been reporting to me in his simplified monthly summaries. The company that he claimed was performing adequately under challenging market conditions was actually generating enormous profits from the higher margin projects he had shifted us toward. I stared at those numbers for a long time, feeling something cold and sharp settling in my stomach. Either Harrison was incompetent at basic financial reporting, or he was deliberately providing me with misleading information about my own company's performance. Neither possibility spoke well of the arrangement I had agreed to, but the second option suggested something far more sinister than simple professional inadequacy. Instead of calling Harrison immediately to ask about the discrepancy, I decided to do something I hadn't done in months. I put on my best business attire and drove to the Lewis Enterprises office to see for myself what was happening at the company Thomas and I had built together. I told the receptionist I was there for an impromptu visit to see how things were running, the way any owner might do when checking on her investment. The reaction was immediate and telling. Within minutes of my arrival, 3 different managers had found excuses to stop by the reception area, each one expressing surprise at seeing me and asking if there was anything specific I needed or any particular reason for my visit. Their nervousness was palpable, like employees who had been caught doing something they shouldn't be doing and were trying to assess how much trouble they might be in. Harrison appeared within 10 minutes, his usual polished composure slightly frayed around the edges. "Mrs. Lewis, what a pleasant surprise. I wish you had called ahead so I could have prepared a proper presentation of our current projects. Is there something specific you wanted to review today?" I smiled with the sweetness I had perfected during decades of dealing with difficult people in charitable work. "Oh, I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to see how everyone was doing. I know Thomas always believed in staying connected with the day-to-day operations, and I realized I haven't been here in months." What followed was the most revealing hour I had spent since Thomas's death. Harrison led me through the offices with the kind of guided tour designed to show only what he wanted me to see. But his careful management of my visit told me more than any financial report could have. Certain offices were mysteriously empty when we passed them. Several employees seemed surprised to see me, as if they had been told I was no longer actively involved with the company. Most telling of all, the community room where Thomas had held his weekly meetings with project managers had been converted into storage space, suggesting that the collaborative management style he had valued was no longer part of the company culture. During the brief meeting Harrison arranged with the senior staff, I asked casual questions about our current projects and was startled to learn that Lewis Enterprises was no longer involved in any affordable housing developments. Every current project was focused on luxury residential developments or commercial properties targeting high-end clients. When I asked about our commitment to community development, I was told that those projects had been phased out for efficiency reasons. The affordable housing market has become increasingly challenging, explained Margaret Sutton, who had been Thomas's longest-serving project manager. Harrison helped us analyze the profit margins, and it became clear that we needed to focus on projects that could generate better returns if we wanted to remain competitive. Margaret's explanation was delivered with the kind of rehearsed precision that suggested she had given this speech before, but her eyes told a different story. She kept glancing at Harrison as she spoke, and when I asked follow-up questions about specific projects we had been planning before Thomas's death, she deferred to Harrison for answers, rather than speaking from her own knowledge of the work. The most disturbing revelation came when I asked to see the conference room where Thomas had kept his project timelines and community impact charts. Harrison explained that the room had been reorganized for better efficiency, but when he reluctantly showed me the space, I found that all of Thomas's documentation about community partnerships and social impact goals had been removed. The walls that had once displayed photographs of families moving into homes we had built, charts showing job creation numbers, and thank you letters from community organizations were now covered with generic motivational posters about productivity and profitability. We streamlined the record-keeping system, Harrison said when I asked about the missing documentation. Some of the information your husband maintained was more sentimental than operationally useful. We kept the essential project files and disposed of materials that weren't directly relevant to current operations. Disposed of. Thomas's careful documentation of the positive impact our work had on real families and communities had been dismissed as sentimental clutter and thrown away. The evidence of everything we had built together, the proof that business success and community service could go hand in hand, had been eliminated to make room for what Harrison considered more important priorities. I left the office that day with a clear understanding that Lewis Enterprises was no longer the company Thomas and I had created. Under Harrison's management, it had been transformed into exactly the kind of profit-focused operation that Thomas had spent his career trying to prove was unnecessary. The workers who had shared his vision of business as a force for community good had either been re-educated or replaced. The projects that had reflected our values had been abandoned in favor of developments that generated higher returns for investors. But more importantly, I left with the realization that I had been systematically excluded from these changes through a combination of misleading information and gentle manipulation designed to keep me ignorant of what was happening to my own company. The monthly reports that showed adequate performance were lies. The suggestions that I focus on enjoying retirement rather than worrying about business operations were tactics to prevent me from discovering how dramatically the company's mission had changed. That evening, I sat in my bland condominium kitchen with a legal pad and began reconstructing everything I could remember about the financial information I had been given since Thomas's death. The monthly allowance payments, the quarterly investment reports, the simplified summaries of company performance. When I laid it all out chronologically, patterns emerged that made my stomach clench with recognition. The monthly allowance I received was significantly less than what I should have been earning based on the company's actual profits. The investment reports showed steady but modest growth, but they never provided specific details about what assets were being managed or how the investment decisions were being made. Most telling of all, I had been gradually excluded from information about the foundation's activities and financial status, despite being its founder and supposedly its primary beneficiary. I realized that I needed to understand exactly what had happened to the Alma Grace Foundation, the organization that had been my life's work and was supposedly continuing under Vivian's leadership. I had been receiving brief updates about the foundation's activities through Daniel and Vivian, but I hadn't seen actual financial statements or program reports in over a year. For an organization that I had built and that bore my name, I had remarkably little knowledge about its current operations. The next morning, I called the foundation office and asked to speak with Janet Morrison, who had been our program coordinator for 8 years and who had worked closely with me on every major initiative we had undertaken. Janet's reaction to my call was strangely formal, almost nervous, as if she was surprised to hear from me and wasn't sure how to respond. "Mrs. Lewis, it's wonderful to hear from you. How are you enjoying your retirement? We've all been hoping you're taking good care of yourself and finding time to relax after all those years of hard work." The word retirement hit me like a slap. I had never announced my retirement from foundation work. I had stepped back from the day-to-day presidency when Vivian took over, but I had never indicated that I was withdrawing from involvement entirely. Yet Janet was speaking to me as if I was a former employee who had left the organization and moved on to other things. "Janet, I'm not retired from foundation work," I said carefully. "I'm still very much interested in what we're accomplishing and how our programs are serving the community. I was hoping we could schedule a time for me to come in and review our current projects." There was a long pause before Janet responded, and when she did, her voice carried a note of confusion mixed with something that might have been embarrassment. "Mrs. Lewis, I think you might want to speak directly with Vivian about that. She's made some changes to our board structure and operational procedures, and I'm not sure what the current policy is regarding visits from former board members." Former board members. I was being described as a former board member of the organization I had founded, built, and led for 12 years. Janet, who had implemented my vision and worked under my direct supervision for nearly a decade, was now treating me like an outsider who needed permission to visit the foundation that bore my name. I called Vivian immediately, my hands shaking with a combination of anger and disbelief. When she answered, her voice carried the same surprised tone I had heard from Janet, as if my call was unexpected and potentially problematic. "Alma, how nice to hear from you. Is everything all right? You sound upset about something." I forced myself to speak calmly, though every instinct was screaming that something was very wrong. "Vivian, I called the foundation office this morning and Janet seemed confused about my status with the organization. She referred to me as a former board member and said I would need to speak with you about visiting to review our current programs." Another pause, longer this time, before Vivian responded with the kind of careful tone people use when they're trying to manage someone they consider unstable. "Alma, I think there might be some confusion here. When you stepped down from the presidency, the board voted to restructure our governance model. We felt it would be healthier for everyone, including you, if there was a clear transition that allowed you to focus on your personal healing, rather than feeling obligated to stay involved in work that might be emotionally demanding during your grief process." "I never stepped down from the board," I said, my voice getting sharper despite my efforts to stay calm. "I stepped down from the presidency to let you take over daily operations, but I never resigned from the organization entirely." "I understand why you might remember it that way," Vivian said with the patient tone reserved for people who are confused about important details. "Grief can sometimes affect our memory of conversations and decisions made during difficult periods. But the board minutes clearly show that you submitted a resignation letter expressing your desire to focus on personal matters rather than continued organizational involvement. The accusation that grief had affected my memory was like being punched in the stomach, but the claim about a resignation letter was even more alarming. I had never written any such letter, never indicated any desire to completely withdraw from the foundation's work. Either Vivian was lying about the existence of such a letter, or someone had forged my signature on a document I had never seen. "Vivian, I need to see a copy of this resignation letter you're referring to. I have no memory of writing any such document, and I want to review the board minutes that show this decision being made." The silence that followed was telling. When Vivian finally responded, her voice had lost its patient warmth and taken on a cooler, more businesslike tone. "Alma, I'm concerned that you're becoming agitated about organizational matters that were resolved months ago." Maybe this would be a good time for you to speak with Daniel about these concerns. He might be able to help you work through any confusion you're experiencing about decisions that were made during a very difficult time in your life. The suggestion that I needed Daniel to help me work through my confusion was the final insult. Vivian was treating me like a confused elderly woman who couldn't be trusted to remember her own decisions. Someone who needed family members to interpret reality for her because her own perceptions were unreliable. But her evasiveness about providing documentation told me everything I needed to know. If there really was a resignation letter with my signature, she would have produced it immediately to prove her point. If the board minutes really showed a legitimate decision process, she would have offered to share them to clear up my confusion. Instead, she was deflecting my questions and suggesting that my concerns were evidence of emotional instability rather than legitimate requests for information about my own organization. I hung up from that conversation with crystal clear understanding that I had been systematically removed from the foundation I had created, using tactics designed to make me believe that the decision was mine, and that questioning it was evidence of mental confusion. The organization that bore my name was no longer under my control, and my exclusion had been accomplished so smoothly that even the staff who had worked with me for years now viewed me as a former colleague rather than the founder they had once reported to. That afternoon, I made an appointment with James Richardson, the attorney who had handled Thomas's estate planning but who had not been involved in the business restructuring that followed his death. James had known Thomas and me for 15 years, had helped us establish both the foundation and various business entities, and would presumably have access to the original documentation that established my legal rights and responsibilities. James's reaction to my questions was immediate concern, not about my mental state, but about the legal implications of what I was describing. Unlike Harrison, Daniel, and Vivian, he didn't treat my concerns as evidence of confusion or grief-related memory problems. Instead, he asked detailed questions about the specific changes that had been made and requested copies of all the documents that had been used to justify my exclusion from organizations I had founded. Alma, I need to see the board resolutions that removed you from the foundation, the business agreements that gave Harrison management authority over Lewis Enterprises, and any documentation that established the monthly allowance system. Based on what you're telling me, there may be serious legal issues with how these changes were implemented. James's professional concern validated my growing suspicion that I had been manipulated rather than protected. When I explained that I had not been provided with copies of many of these documents, and that my requests for information were being deflected with suggestions that I was confused or emotionally unstable, his expression became grim. Alma, you have legal rights as the owner of Lewis Enterprises and as the founder of the Alma Grace Foundation. No one has the authority to exclude you from information about organizations you control, regardless of any management agreements or board restructuring that may have occurred. If you're being denied access to financial records and organizational documents, we need to find out why, and we need to find out immediately. For the first time in months, I felt like someone was taking my concerns seriously, rather than dismissing them as evidence of an emotional problem that needed to be managed. James treated me like a competent adult who had legitimate questions about her own legal and financial situation. His respect for my intelligence and his professional assessment of potential wrongdoing gave me the confidence to pursue answers rather than accepting explanations that had never really made sense. The investigation began with James requesting copies of all the legal documents that had been executed since Thomas's death. As the owner of Lewis Enterprises and the founder of the Alma Grace Foundation, I had the right to review any agreements or changes that affected my interests, regardless of what management structures had been put in place. Harrison's response to the document request was immediate and defensive. Within 2 days of James's formal letter, Harrison called to schedule an urgent meeting to, quote, clear up any misunderstandings about the business arrangements we had agreed to. His tone was no longer the polished professionalism I had grown accustomed to, but something sharper and more aggressive. Mrs. Lewis, I'm concerned that you're being influenced by outside parties who may not have your best interests at heart, Harrison said when we met in James's office. The arrangements we've established have been designed specifically to protect your financial security and reduce the stress of managing complex business operations during your period of adjustment. James interrupted before I could respond. Mr. Blackwood, my client isn't questioning the value of professional management. She's requesting copies of the legal documents that establish the scope of your authority and the terms of the financial arrangements you've implemented. As the owner of the company, she has an absolute right to review any agreements that affect her interests. Harrison's discomfort was obvious as he shuffled through his briefcase and produced a folder of documents. Of course, I'm happy to provide any documentation Mrs. Lewis requests. I just want to make sure she understands that these arrangements were established with her full knowledge and consent, and that any changes to the current structure could have significant negative consequences for her financial security. The warning about negative consequences felt like a threat, but James and I ignored it while we reviewed the documents Harrison had brought. What we found was both illuminating and infuriating. The management agreement I had supposedly signed gave Harrison far broader authority than I remembered agreeing to, including the right to make major strategic decisions without my prior approval, and the right to restructure company operations as he deemed appropriate for maximizing profitability. More disturbing still, the signature on the management agreement didn't look quite like my normal handwriting. The letters were formed correctly, but the pressure and spacing were subtly different from my usual signature style. When James asked Harrison about the circumstances under which the document had been signed, his explanation was vague and contradictory. Mrs. Lewis signed the agreement during one of our early meetings, when she was still very emotional about her husband's death. She may not remember all the details of our conversation, but she was definitely clear about wanting professional management to handle the day-to-day operations so she could focus on her personal healing. James requested the original document for handwriting analysis, and Harrison's objection was immediate and telling. He claimed that the original was stored in a safety deposit box for security purposes, and that providing it for analysis would be unnecessarily complicated. When James explained that a handwriting analysis was a routine procedure for verifying document authenticity, Harrison's demeanor became openly hostile. I'm not sure what you're implying, but I resent any suggestion that Mrs. Lewis's signature was obtained improperly. She was competent to make decisions when the agreement was signed, and questioning the validity of documents she executed is insulting to her intelligence and my professional integrity. The meeting ended with Harrison gathering his papers and leaving abruptly, but not before making one final comment that revealed more than he probably intended. Mrs. Lewis, I hope you realize that challenging these arrangements could have serious consequences for your financial security. The monthly allowance system depends on maintaining the current management structure, and any disruption to these agreements could affect your ability to maintain your current lifestyle. After Harrison left, James and I sat in his office reviewing the documents and discussing the implications of what we had discovered. The management agreement gave Harrison control over company operations that extended far beyond what would be normal for a business consultant. The foundation documents showed that my resignation had been accepted by a board vote that occurred at a meeting I had never been notified about. Most significantly, the financial arrangements that provided my monthly allowance were structured in a way that made me dependent on Harrison's continued management, rather than giving me direct access to my own assets. Alma, I need to tell you that what I'm seeing here raises serious questions about potential financial abuse, James said, his expression grim. The combination of questionable signatures, excessive management authority, and financial arrangements that limit your access to your own assets suggests a pattern of behavior designed to gain control over your resources while making you dependent on the people who are managing them. Financial abuse. The words hung in the air between us like an accusation that was both shocking and inevitable. Everything that had happened since Thomas's death, every gentle suggestion about what would be best for me, every reassurance about my need to focus on healing, rather than worrying about complicated business matters, had been part of a systematic effort to gain control over the wealth Thomas and I had built together. James recommended that we begin by demanding full financial disclosure from both Harrison and the Foundation Board, including detailed accounting of all money that had been managed on my behalf since Thomas's death. We would also request independent audits of both Lewis Enterprises and the Alma Grace Foundation to determine whether any funds had been misappropriated or used for purposes other than what had been represented to me. The people who have been managing your affairs may have legitimate explanations for everything they've done, James said, though his tone suggested he considered that possibility unlikely. But you have the right to understand exactly how your money has been handled. And anyone who objects to providing that information is probably hiding something you need to know about. The conversation with James gave me something I hadn't felt in months, a sense of my own power and agency in determining what happened to my life and my assets. For the first time since Thomas's death, I wasn't being told what I needed or what would be best for me. Instead, I was being treated as someone capable of making informed decisions about my own interests, someone whose questions were legitimate and whose concerns deserved to be taken seriously. That evening, I sat in my condominium with the legal documents spread across my dining table and began making a list of everything I wanted to understand about my financial situation. The list was longer than I had expected, covering not just the arrangements Harrison had implemented, but also questions about foundation spending, investment strategies, and the disposition of assets that had been part of Thomas's estate. As I wrote down my questions, I realized that for the past 18 months, I had been accepting other people's explanations for decisions that affected my life without demanding the detailed information I needed to evaluate whether those decisions were actually in my best interests. I had been treated like someone too emotional and confused to understand complex matters, and I had gradually begun to believe that assessment myself. But reviewing the legal documents with James had reminded me that I wasn't a confused widow who needed to be protected from complicated information. I was Alma Grace Lewis, a woman who had co-founded a successful business, built a major charitable organization from nothing, and managed complex projects and relationships for 4 decades. The skills that had made me successful in business and philanthropy hadn't disappeared when Thomas died. They had simply been dismissed and ignored by people who benefited from my passivity. The woman they thought was too grief-stricken to understand financial matters was about to demonstrate exactly how much she had learned during months of careful observation. And what she had learned was enough to expose everything they had done while thinking she was too confused to notice. The independent audit results arrived on a cold February morning, delivered in 3 thick manila envelopes that contained enough evidence to destroy every lie I had been told over the past 18 months. James had arranged for forensic accountants to examine both Lewis Enterprises and the Alma Grace Foundation, while a separate investigator had traced the movement of money through various accounts that should have been under my direct control. What they found exceeded even my worst suspicions about the scope of the deception that had been orchestrated around me. The forensic accountant's report on Lewis Enterprises revealed that Harrison had been systematically inflating his management fees while understating the company's actual profits in the reports he provided to me. Over the course of 18 months, he had diverted nearly $2 million from company accounts into consulting fees, administrative expenses, and investment management charges that had never been properly authorized. But the manipulation went far beyond simple embezzlement. Harrison had restructured the company's operations in ways that maximized his personal compensation, while fundamentally altering the mission Thomas and I had established. The community development projects that had been phased out for efficiency reasons had actually been canceled specifically because they included profit-sharing agreements with local community organizations. By eliminating those projects, Harrison had been able to redirect those funds into management fees that benefited him directly. The affordable housing developments that had been Thomas's passion were replaced with luxury residential projects that generated higher gross profits, but required significantly less oversight and community engagement. Harrison had calculated that he could earn more money by managing fewer, more expensive projects than by maintaining the diversified portfolio of community-focused developments that had been our original business model. Most infuriating of all, the audit revealed that Harrison had been using Lewis Enterprises' resources to fund his other consulting contracts, essentially charging me for the overhead costs of managing other clients' businesses. My company had become a subsidizing mechanism for his broader consulting practice, with office space, administrative support, and even travel expenses being billed to Lewis Enterprises, while Harrison provided services to companies that competed directly with us for projects and contracts. The foundation audit was even more devastating. Vivian had not only removed me from the board through a fraudulent resignation letter, but she had also restructured the organization's mission in ways that served her professional ambitions rather than the community needs we had originally identified. The Alma Grace Foundation was no longer focused on microfinance and business training for women in economic crisis. Instead, it had become a grant-making organization that funded international development projects managed by Vivian's former colleagues from graduate school. The women's business training programs that had been our signature initiative were eliminated within 6 months of Vivian taking over, officially because they were too locally focused to achieve meaningful scale. In reality, those programs had been terminated because they required hands-on management and community engagement that interfered with Vivian's broader career objectives in international development work. The microfinance loans that had helped hundreds of local women start small businesses were replaced with large grants to established nonprofit organizations working in developing countries. While those organizations were undoubtedly doing valuable work, they had no connection to the community needs that had inspired Thomas and me to establish the foundation in the first place. The Alma Grace Foundation had become a vehicle for Vivian to build relationships with international development professionals, rather than an organization dedicated to supporting women in our own community. Even more appalling, the audit revealed that Vivian had been using foundation resources to fund her own professional development, including graduate school coursework, conference attendance, and international travel that was only tangentially related to the foundation's work. She had essentially converted the organization into a personal career development fund, while maintaining the public appearance of continuing the charitable mission Thomas and I had established. The financial investigator's report on my personal accounts was the final piece of evidence I needed to understand the full scope of what had been done to me. The monthly allowance system that Harrison had presented as a simplified way to manage my finances was actually a mechanism for controlling my access to money, while he and Vivian redirected the majority of my assets into accounts and investments that served their interests rather than mine. The allowance I received each month represented less than 30% of the income my assets should have been generating. The remaining 70% was being reinvested through management companies that Harrison controlled, generating fees and commissions that enriched him, while my actual wealth remained essentially stagnant. Rather than the financial growth I had been told was occurring through professional investment management, my net worth had actually declined significantly since Thomas's death. But the most shocking discovery was that Daniel had been receiving monthly payments from both the Foundation and Lewis Enterprises, supposedly for legal services rendered to both organizations. These payments totaled nearly $300,000 over 18 months, for legal work that had never been specifically described to me, and that seemed to consist primarily of creating the documentation needed to exclude me from decision-making in my own organizations. My son, the man I had raised to understand that success meant lifting others up alongside yourself, had been financially benefiting from the systematic dismantling of everything his father and I had built together. The attorney who had supposedly been looking out for my best interests during my period of grief had actually been paid to create the legal framework that made my exploitation possible. Armed with this evidence, James and I scheduled a meeting with Daniel, Vivian, and Harrison to present our findings and demand immediate restoration of my control over my own assets. I insisted that the meeting take place in the conference room at Lewis Enterprises, the same space where Harrison had removed all evidence of Thomas's community-focused vision and replaced it with generic corporate motivational materials. The symbolism felt important. I wanted to confront them in the place where our family's legacy had been systematically erased, where the values Thomas and I had spent decades building into our business had been discarded in favor of pure profit maximization. I wanted them to face the consequences of their actions in the environment they had created through their betrayal of everything we had worked to achieve. Daniel arrived first, looking nervous and avoiding eye contact as he took a seat across from where I sat with James and the audit reports spread before us. He had clearly been warned that this meeting would be about financial irregularities, but his expression suggested he wasn't sure exactly how much I had discovered, or what legal consequences he might be facing. Vivian entered with the confident stride of someone who believed she still controlled the narrative, but her composure wavered when she saw the thick folders of documentation on the conference table. She had spent 18 months convincing everyone that I was too confused and emotional to understand complex financial matters, and she clearly hadn't anticipated that I would be capable of commissioning professional audits of organizations she thought she had successfully taken control of. Harrison was the last to arrive, and his demeanor had shifted dramatically from the polished professionalism he had maintained throughout our previous interactions. He looked like a man who had been caught in a criminal act and was trying to calculate whether denial or confession would serve him better in the legal proceedings that were obviously coming. I let James begin the presentation, partly because his professional authority would carry more weight with people who had spent months dismissing my concerns, but mostly because I wanted to watch their faces as the full scope of their deception was laid out systematically. Each revelation hit them like a physical blow, and by the time James had finished reviewing the embezzlement evidence, all three of them looked like they were going to be sick. The forensic accounting clearly shows a pattern of financial abuse designed to gain control over Mrs. Lewis's assets while making her dependent on the very people who were stealing from her, James said, his voice carrying the cold precision of someone presenting evidence in a criminal trial. The coordination between these activities suggests conspiracy, which elevates the potential charges from simple embezzlement to organized fraud. Daniel was the first to attempt a response, his voice shaking as he tried to maintain the fiction that everything had been done in my best interests. "Mom, I know this looks bad when it's presented this way, but you have to understand that we were trying to protect you during a very difficult time. Dad's death left you vulnerable, and we were concerned that unscrupulous people might try to take advantage of your grief." The irony of his statement was so blatant that I almost laughed. My son was claiming that he had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from me in order to protect me from people who might try to steal from me. He was presenting his own criminal behavior as evidence of his concern for my welfare, as if embezzlement became a form of family care when it was perpetrated by relatives rather than strangers. "Daniel," I said, my voice carrying a calmness that surprised even me, "you are the unscrupulous people who took advantage of my grief. You, Vivian, and Harrison spent 18 months systematically stealing from me, while convincing me that I was too confused to understand what you were doing. You didn't protect me from financial predators. You were the financial predators." Vivian attempted to regain control of the conversation by shifting to the emotional manipulation tactics that had worked so effectively during the previous months. "Alma, I understand that you're upset, but I think you're misinterpreting actions that were taken with genuine love and concern for your well-being. Sometimes when people are grieving, they can see malicious intent in decisions that were actually made to help them." The suggestion that I was misinterpreting clear evidence of embezzlement because of grief-related confusion was the same tactic she had used to dismiss all of my previous concerns. But this time, instead of making me doubt my own perceptions, her condescending tone only reinforced my certainty that everything she had done was calculated manipulation rather than genuine concern. I opened the folder containing the foundation audit and placed the fraudulent resignation letter on the table in front of her. "Vivian, this is the resignation letter you claim I submitted to remove myself from the foundation board. The handwriting analysis shows that this signature was forged. You literally committed fraud to steal an organization that I founded and built over 12 years of dedicated work." The color drained from Vivian's face as she stared at the document, but she continued to maintain her innocence, even when confronted with professional handwriting analysis that proved her criminality. "That's impossible. I watched you sign that letter myself. Maybe the stress of losing Thomas affected your handwriting, or maybe the analysis is incorrect. There has to be some reasonable explanation that doesn't involve accusations of fraud." Harrison finally spoke, but instead of denying the charges, he attempted to minimize their significance by claiming that all of his actions had been authorized through the management agreements I had signed. "Mrs. Lewis, every financial decision I made was within the scope of authority granted to me through our legal agreements. If you were dissatisfied with my management style, the appropriate response would have been to terminate our contract, not to commission audits designed to find fault with legitimate business practices." James responded before I could, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who had prosecuted financial crimes and recognized every excuse Harrison was attempting to use. "Mr. Blackwood, the management agreement you're referring to was signed under false pretenses, with a forged signature, and granted you authority that no reasonable person would have given to a business consultant. More importantly, you exceeded even that fraudulent authority by diverting funds to personal accounts and using company resources for your own benefit." The meeting continued for another hour, with each of them attempting different strategies to minimize their culpability or shift blame to the others. Daniel claimed he had been manipulated by Harrison and Vivian into believing that the financial arrangements were legitimate. Vivian insisted that she had genuinely believed I wanted to withdraw from active involvement in the foundation. Harrison maintained that all of his fees had been reasonable compensation for the professional services he had provided. But their desperation was obvious, and their attempts to maintain innocence were undermined by the overwhelming evidence James had compiled. The forensic accounting didn't lie, the handwriting analysis couldn't be disputed, and the pattern of coordination between their activities made it clear that this had been a planned conspiracy, rather than a series of misunderstandings or well-intentioned mistakes. I listened to their excuses and justifications with a sense of calm detachment that surprised me. For months, these three people had made me feel confused, incompetent, and overly emotional whenever I questioned their decisions. They had systematically undermined my confidence in my own judgment, while presenting themselves as the rational adults who understood complex matters that were beyond my comprehension. Now, faced with irrefutable evidence of their crimes, they were the ones who seemed confused and emotional. Their explanations were illogical, their justifications were transparently self-serving, and their desperation was palpable. The people who had treated me like a confused child were revealed to be exactly what they had accused me of being: too emotional and irrational to think clearly about the consequences of their actions. When they had exhausted their attempts to explain away the evidence, I finally spoke with the authority that had been stolen from me 18 months earlier. Daniel, Vivian, Harrison, you are all going to return every dollar you stole from me, plus interest and penalties. You are going to restore my control over Lewis Enterprises and the Alma Grace Foundation immediately. And you are going to do this voluntarily, because the alternative is criminal prosecution for conspiracy, embezzlement, and fraud. The silence that followed was profound. These three people who had spent months making decisions about my life and my assets without consulting me were now waiting to hear what I had decided about their futures. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship since Thomas's death had completely reversed, and they were beginning to understand that their actions had consequences they had never anticipated. Daniel was the first to break, his voice cracking as he tried to appeal to family loyalty to avoid the legal consequences of his crimes. Mom, please don't destroy our family over this. I know we made mistakes, but we're still your family. Emma and Lily need their father, and Vivian is pregnant with our third child. Please don't put us through criminal prosecution when we can work this out privately. The mention of my granddaughters was clearly intended to manipulate my emotions, but instead of softening my resolve, it only strengthened my determination to hold them accountable. Emma and Lily did need their father, but they needed a father who understood that stealing from family members was wrong, not a father who thought family relationships exempted him from basic moral and legal standards. Daniel, you should have thought about Emma and Lily before you decided to steal from their grandmother, I said. Your children deserve to grow up knowing that actions have consequences, and that family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior. If you're concerned about their welfare, you should focus on making restitution quickly, rather than trying to avoid responsibility for what you've done. The negotiations that followed were handled primarily by James, with input from criminal attorneys he brought in to assess the strength of the case against all three defendants. The evidence was overwhelming enough that prosecutors would have had no difficulty securing convictions, and the amounts involved were large enough to guarantee significant prison sentences for everyone involved. Faced with the certainty of criminal prosecution if they refused to cooperate, Daniel, Vivian, and Harrison agreed to a settlement that restored all of my assets and returned control of both organizations to me. Daniel and Harrison were required to liquidate personal assets to repay the money they had stolen, while Vivian was forced to resign from the foundation and return all salary and benefits she had received since taking over my position. But the financial restitution was only part of what I demanded. I also required public acknowledgement of what they had done, both to clear my reputation and to ensure that other potential victims would be warned about their willingness to exploit vulnerable people for financial gain. Harrison's business consulting license was revoked after the state regulatory board reviewed the evidence of his crimes. Vivian was reported to the nonprofit professional association that had certified her credentials, resulting in permanent disbarment from working in charitable organizations. Daniel faced the most severe consequences, as his legal license was suspended pending a full ethics review by the State Bar Association. The son, who had grown up volunteering at our foundation, who had given speeches about the importance of helping families in crisis, was now professionally sanctioned for exploiting his own mother during her period of grief. The restoration of my control over Lewis Enterprises and the Alma Grace Foundation allowed me to immediately begin reversing the damage that had been done to both organizations. The company's community development projects were reinstated, with renewed commitments to affordable housing and local economic development. The foundation's women's business training programs were reestablished, and the international development grants that had served Vivian's career objectives were replaced with local initiatives that addressed real community needs. But the most important change was in how I understood my own capabilities and my right to make decisions about my own life. For 18 months, I had been convinced that grief had made me incompetent to handle complex matters, that I needed other people to protect me from my own poor judgment, and that questioning the decisions made on my behalf was evidence of emotional instability. The successful investigation and recovery of my stolen assets proved conclusively that I had never been incompetent or confused. I had been deliberately misled by people who benefited from my passivity, people who used my grief as a weapon against my competence and independence. The woman who had built a successful business and charitable organization hadn't disappeared when Thomas died. She had simply been suppressed by people who found her strength inconvenient for their criminal objectives. The legal proceedings took nearly a year to complete, but throughout that time I felt more energetic and purposeful than I had since Thomas's death. Instead of being managed and protected by other people, I was actively fighting for my rights and working to rebuild the organizations that reflected my values. Instead of accepting other people's assessment of what I needed or what would be best for me, I was making my own decisions and taking responsibility for the consequences. The twins' reaction to the changes in our family was initially confused, but ultimately positive. Emma and Lily had never understood why their Sunday visits to Nana Grace's house had become so subdued, and why their grandmother seemed sad and distant compared to the energetic woman who had helped them plant gardens and build fort blankets before Grandpa died. As I regained control of my life and my work, I also regained my enthusiasm for the activities that had brought me joy when Thomas was alive. The twins once again spent Wednesday afternoons with me, helping with foundation projects and learning about the importance of helping other people. Our Sunday dinners returned to the elaborate family meals that had been a tradition, though now they took place in the new house I bought after selling the sterile condominium that had never felt like home. Daniel and Vivian's marriage survived the criminal proceedings, though their relationship with me remained permanently altered. They were allowed supervised visits with the twins, and Daniel was eventually able to rebuild his law practice after completing the ethics requirements imposed by the State Bar Association. But the easy intimacy and trust that had once defined our family relationships was destroyed by their betrayal, replaced by polite interactions that acknowledged our biological connections without pretending that deeper bonds still existed. The most satisfying aspect of my recovery was the restoration of my professional, reputation, and community relationships. The people who had worked with me for decades in philanthropic activities welcomed my return with enthusiasm, and several organizations that had distanced themselves during my period of supposed retirement reached out to rebuild connections. The woman who had been written off as a confused widow, unable to manage her own affairs, was recognized once again as a competent leader whose experience and judgment were valuable to the community. 6 months after the legal settlement was finalized, I received an unexpected phone call from Margaret Sutton, the project manager who had worked with Thomas for over 15 years and who had seemed so uncomfortable during my surprise visit to Lewis Enterprises during Harrison's management. Margaret asked if we could meet for coffee, saying she had something important to tell me about what had happened at the company after Thomas's death. We met at a cafe near the Lewis Enterprises office, and Margaret's first words were an apology for her failure to contact me directly when Harrison began making changes that she knew Thomas would never have approved. "Mrs. Lewis, I need you to know that several of us tried to raise concerns about Harrison's management decisions, but we were told that you had specifically requested that we not bother you with operational details while you were grieving." Margaret's revelation confirmed what I had suspected but never been able to prove. Harrison had deliberately isolated me from employees who might have informed me about the changes he was making, using my grief as justification for excluding me from communications that would have revealed his deception much earlier. The employees who had worked closely with Thomas and understood his values had been prevented from maintaining their loyalty to the mission we had established together. "We knew something was wrong," Margaret continued, But Harrison convinced us that questioning his authority would be harmful to you during a difficult time. He made it seem like protecting you from business stress was more important than maintaining the company culture that Mr. Thomas had worked so hard to build. Margaret's explanation illustrated how effective emotional manipulation could be in preventing people from taking action, even when they recognized that something was fundamentally wrong. Harrison had weaponized my grief not only against me, but against the employees who might have supported me if they had understood that I was being deliberately excluded from information about my own company. The conversation with Margaret led to broader discussions with other Lewis Enterprises employees who had been troubled by Harrison's changes but had been convinced that loyalty to me required accepting his management decisions without question. As these employees learned the truth about what had been done to me, several of them provided additional evidence of Harrison's misconduct that strengthened the criminal case against him and helped recover additional stolen funds. But more importantly, these conversations allowed me to rebuild relationships with people who had been Thomas's colleagues and who shared our commitment to using business success as a platform for community service. The company culture that had been systematically dismantled during Harrison's management was gradually restored as employees felt empowered to once again prioritize community benefit alongside profitability. 2 years after Thomas's death, I found myself in a position that was both familiar and completely new. I was once again running Lewis Enterprises and the Alma Grace Foundation, organizations that reflected my values and served purposes that gave my life meaning. But I was no longer the woman who had defined herself primarily through her relationships to other people, who had needed Thomas's partnership to feel confident in her own judgment, or who had been willing to subordinate her own interests to maintain family harmony. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had also revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and taught me lessons about my own worth that no amount of success in business or philanthropy could have provided. The woman who had once sought approval and validation from family members and professional colleagues no longer needed external confirmation of her competence or value. The experience of being systematically undermined, and then successfully fighting back, had given me unshakable confidence in my own judgment and my right to determine the direction of my own life. The most profound change was in how I understood family relationships and the obligations that come with love and loyalty. For decades, I had believed that loving someone meant accepting their judgment about what was best for me, even when that judgment conflicted with my own preferences or interests. I had confused accommodation with affection and compromise with commitment. The discovery that my own son and daughter-in-law had been willing to steal from me while presenting their theft as evidence of their care taught me that family relationships, like all relationships, must be based on mutual respect rather than unquestioning loyalty. Love that requires the sacrifice of independence, integrity, or self-respect isn't actually love at all. It's exploitation disguised as affection, and it serves the interests of the people demanding sacrifice rather than the people being asked to provide it. Standing in my new home office on a bright spring morning, reviewing foundation grant applications and planning the next phase of Lewis Enterprises community development work, I felt a satisfaction that was both deeply familiar and entirely new. The work itself was the same meaningful activity that had energized me throughout my adult life, but my approach to it had been transformed by everything I had learned about my own strength and resilience. I was no longer doing this work because it was expected of me, or because it provided a way to support Thomas's vision, or because it made other people proud of me. I was doing it because it reflected my own values and served purposes that I had chosen for myself. The woman who had once needed permission and approval to make decisions about her own life had discovered that the only permission she really needed was her own. The brass nameplate on my desk read simply Alma Grace Lewis, President and Founder, but it might as well have read Woman Who Refused to Disappear. Because that ultimately was what the entire experience had been about. It had been an attempt to erase me from my own life, to reduce me to a managed dependent whose only value was as a source of income for other people's ambitions. It had been a systematic effort to convince me that I was too confused, too emotional, and too incompetent to be trusted with decisions about my own interests. But I had refused to disappear. I had refused to accept other people's assessment of my capabilities. I had refused to believe that grief had made me incompetent, or that family loyalty required me to accept criminal behavior. Most importantly, I had refused to let other people's convenience determine the scope of my own possibilities. The story that had begun with my discovery of financial documents hidden behind charitable deception had become something larger and more significant than simple crime and punishment. It had become a testament to the possibility of reclaiming power that had been stolen through manipulation and lies. It had become proof that strength and competence don't disappear just because other people find them inconvenient. And it had become a reminder that sometimes the people who claim to love us most are the ones who benefit most from our weakness, our confusion, and our willingness to let them make decisions about our lives. The greatest gift I could give to other women facing similar manipulation was the example of someone who had fought back successfully, someone who had refused to accept that betrayal was inevitable, or that family loyalty required the sacrifice of personal dignity. The woman who had once been called a charity case had indeed become someone's charity. She had become her own charity, investing in her own strength, supporting her own judgment, and funding her own independence. And that investment had paid dividends that no financial portfolio could ever match. The unshakable knowledge that she was exactly as capable, intelligent, and valuable as she had always believed herself to be, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. That knowledge, once earned, could never be stolen again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.